Thank you also to Fiona Perry for making the technology work, especially under duress. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the characteristics of different kinds of dictatorships, and I will be using Russia as my main example. But my goal here is also to have us think about how the characteristics of these different kinds of dictatorships might apply to the United States, or to other countries that you might feel particularly meaningful, to other countries that might be particularly meaningful to you. So I'm going to be asking you to do that part, to do the applying part. So as I'm laying out the information about dictatorship in Russia over the next 25 minutes or so, I would like you to be thinking about which elements of different kinds of dictatorships you think might be relevant to or might apply to the United States right now, or in the near future, or in the past, or again to other places that you think are relevant. This is kind of an exercise in what we call comparative politics, right? Which is trying to recognize patterns of politics across different countries and at different times. And I would also like you to think about the elements of dictatorship that you think really don't seem like they apply to the United States. And I will ask you to talk about the similarities and maybe the differences afterwards. So without further ado, I will say a bit about Russia and dictatorship. So Russia has the sad distinction of having hosted a variety of types of dictatorships as their ruling system. And I am going to talk about two of those. There has been a lot of discussion, especially since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022, about what kind of state Russia is, how Russia is governed, what kind of political system it is, how much power President Vladimir Putin has, and what that power rests on. I think to some extent, Russia's political system is a bit like the parable about the blind people who are touching an elephant, right? The conclusion that you draw about what an elephant is like all depends on what part of the elephant you are touching. And in Russia's case, just about no matter what part you have your hand on at the moment, it's feeling increasingly worse. It's less malleable, it's less flexible, there's less space for the characteristics of democracy. So what I'm going to do today is to start with the question of whether Russia is best described as sort of the worst kind of dictatorship, a totalitarian regime, and then I will provide some other options, some other ways to help us analyze Russia's political system, especially considering the fact that the state has initiated this aggressive war against a neighboring country and has illegally occupied and annexed parts of Ukraine's territory starting in 2014, and obviously much more expansively, and with the application of violence over much more of Ukraine's territory starting a little more than 3 years ago. So in thinking about regime types, let us start with totalitarian rule. I believe that the term was first used to describe fascist Italy, but in the aftermath of World War II, when the Cold War began, the Soviet Union went from being a temporary ally of the United States in the struggle against the Nazis and the other Axis powers, to being conceived of as an enemy of the United States. Two political scientists, Karl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski, wrote a book in 1956 trying to explain what the Soviet regime and the defeated Nazi regime had in common, and used this term, totalitarian, to describe both regimes. So Friedrich and Brzezinski identified 6 characteristics of totalitarian regimes. First, and again, like, be thinking in the back of your mind, yes, I'm going to be talking about, right now I'm going to be talking about the Soviet Union, but, keep in your mind contemporary Russia, the United States, other countries that are important to you. So the 6 characteristics of a totalitarian regime. First, that kind of regime has an official state ideology, an official state set of beliefs, like fascism or communism, that points toward achieving some kind of ideal state for humankind. Second, a totalitarian state would have a single mass party based on that ideology, and it runs the state, and it is typically led by one person, by the dictator. Third, there would be total party control over the military, and fourth, total party control over the media. Totalitarian states are also characterized by the use of a terroristic police, a police force that uses terror against the population to help control the population, and also characterized by central planning or centralized governmental direction of the economy. Also, and just as important, under totalitarian regimes, civil society, any form of civic organization, like interest groups such as Greenpeace or the NRA or PTA organizations, any groups that weren't controlled by the party were forbidden, right, were illegal. And the term totalitarian, of course, expresses the overall point, which is an effort to exert total control, to the extent that that's possible, over the state and the society, which the people in charge want to be completely obedient to the party and to the dictator. Now, what makes Russia less easily described now as totalitarian than it was, let's say, under Brezhnev in the 70s, or more so under Stalin in the 30s, is that contemporary Russia is missing the first two ingredients here of the Friedrich and Brzezinski definition. A single party backed by a utopian ideology. So Russia technically has multiple parties, and none of them has a utopian ideology, or really much of an ideology at all. So that's important when we're thinking about what kind of regime it is, or what kind of dictatorship it is. And I will say more about that, about ideology, in a second. But the rest of the criteria that Friedrich and Brzezinski spelled out are increasingly in place in today's Russia. The state appears to be run by one person. There is total control, although it isn't party control, I would say it's executive branch control of the military. There's total executive branch control of the media. There is an increasingly state-controlled economy compared to, say, the 1990s, when a lot of the state-owned economy suddenly and chaotically got privatized. And there is currently in Russia an effort to exert total control over civil society, meaning control over people's speech. So there's been the elimination of freedom of speech and assembly, or at least they're drastically limited, both in person, in public, and on the internet. And to that end, we see an increasingly harsh, in Russia, use of police power over the last 10 years, and especially over the last 3 years since the start of the full-scale invasion. And that police power is targeting political oppositionists, anti-war activists, feminists, people in the LGBTQ community. You can get a jail term in Russia for up to 15 years right now for spreading quote-unquote false information about the Russian military, and you can be fined for discrediting the use of the Russian military, which becomes a criminal offense if you do it more than once in a year. And these laws are basically just extensively being used to punish people for making anti-war remarks, as well as just displaying the colors of the Ukrainian flag, or putting a like on an anti-war social media post, or using the word war, even instead of special military operation, to describe the Russian invasion. All right, now I want to focus in a bit on some aspects of totalitarian regimes that are outside of but closely related to those 6 characteristics. The first has to do with the effort that the government puts into mobilizing the population to show public, visible support for the regime. And that has to do with ideology. So a big difference between totalitarian regimes and today's Russia under Putin is that the Putin regime is what we can call demobilizational. Putin's regime does not want to mobilize people for political action. It wants people to stay home. They want people to be apolitical. So it's nice if there's manifestations of support, for the state or support for Putin, and some of that support has been factored into the state budget in the past to prop up pro-Putin youth organizations, for instance, and images put up by the Kremlin, like all the shirtless Putin images that you can think of. But the state isn't really out to get the people to do a lot of flag waving and marching and shouting the ideology in the streets. So there's no contemporary Russian equivalent of like the little red book, of Chairman Mao's quotations that you had to carry around during the Chinese Cultural Revolution in the 60s and 70s, and there's no slogans to repeat like "Workers of the world, unite." There's none of that kind of ideological mobilization in Russia today that was so common in the Soviet era. There is, however, some contemporary symbolism that the regime is using, like this orange and black striped St. George ribbon, which actually started out as a military award in Russia in 1769. They brought that back to mark the 60th anniversary of World War II in 2005, and the defeat of the Nazis. And also, I think they brought it back to symbolically counter the democratic revolution in Ukraine in 2004, which was called the Orange Revolution. And then the ribbon became much more widespread and much more visible in public after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. In terms of regime symbolism, there's also the letter Z, which is the Latin letter Z. And this is associated with the recent invasion of Ukraine. It shows up on tanks, it shows up on buildings, and you can see it here kind of combined with the St. George ribbon. But under the two major examples of totalitarianism in the 20th century, there was a mobilizing ideology who went way beyond symbolism. It was communism in the Soviet case and Nazism in Germany. Now, by contrast, the closest thing to a mobilizing ideology in Russia today is, I would say, a kind of anti-Westernism that started taking off about a decade ago. It paints Western Europe and the US in particular as a threat to Russian security and to the Russian nation and to its quote-unquote traditional values. You can see this anti-Westernism pretty clearly in policies and attitudes having to do with gender and sexuality. So for example, what is commonly called the Russian gay propaganda law, which is a law from 2013 that basically criminalizes any endorsement of same-sex relationships in front of minors. And that law was then expanded in December of 2022 to ban any positive portrayal of same-sex relationships in public for people of any age. So what basically that means is that it's illegal to depict homosexuality in public. The Patriarch of Russia's Orthodox Church, which is for the most part tightly allied with the regime, Patriarch Kirill, he justified the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 by saying that in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, people were trying to reject the, and I quote, so-called values that are offered today by those who claim world power. And he explained that, quote, in order to join the club of those Western countries, you have to hold a gay pride parade. And he said that what Russia was doing there in the Donbass was protecting, quote, human civilization by making it possible for people in Ukraine to not have to have gay pride parades. So this is a justification for the full-scale invasion. And after the full-scale invasion, Putin himself started making very queer-phobic and especially transphobic comments, which he had almost entirely really refrained from until about 6 months before the invasion. So, for instance, in his speech justifying the illegal annexation of eastern Ukraine in September 2022, he said, in part, I quote, "Do we want to have here in our country in Russia parent number 1, parent number 2, and parent number 3, and then he adds this parenthetical, they have completely lost it over there. Instead of mother and father, do we want our schools to impose on our children from their earliest days perversions that lead to degradation and extinction? Do we want to drum into their heads the idea that certain other genders exist alongside women and men and offer them gender reassignment surgery? Is this what we want for our country and our children? This is all unacceptable to us." So So he said that, he said some other similar things as well, but it is notable that he's talking about this in the context of illegally annexing parts of eastern Ukraine, parts of sovereign Ukraine. So that is as close to a state ideology, I think, as you can get right now in Russia. It's a kind of anti-Western, social conservative traditionalism, but you don't see the regime mobilizing people to go and demonstrate for it in the streets. It is not a mobilizational regime. Now, another aspect of totalitarian rule is mostly related to the use of a terroristic police to keep society in line. One of the ways this is done, because you can't have that many police controlling a large population like Russia's, is to use regular people to control each other. Stalin's regime did this in the 30s by claiming that there were anti-communist spies everywhere trying to destroy the country, so you had to be very careful and not trust anyone. Of course, what there really was at the time was a lot of people who served as informers for the secret police. So you did have to be very careful and not trust anyone, especially if you were going to say anything negative about the Soviet regime, because you could be talking to an informer or a secret police agent, and then that would lead to your arrest and probably worse. This technique is part of what we call atomization, keeping people atomized, right? Like separate atoms, keeping people apart from each other and afraid to trust each other so that they can't and won't organize against the regime. Now, this atomizing aspect of totalitarianism is showing up in contemporary Russia, especially after the invasion of Ukraine, where Russia's population is being used as a supplement to the police and the security services, reporting on each other's anti-war statements to the authorities. Because as I mentioned before, it's illegal to make anti-war statements. And what this does is it shrinks the public arena for free speech. So far this has taken the form of Russian public school students reporting on their teachers who say something negative on the invasion, and then the teachers get fired and fined. Shoppers have also reported on store owners for putting up a sign in their shop that says "No to War," like this one. These kinds of cases of people informing on each other is a classic element of totalitarian society, where you want to prove your loyalty to the regime and maybe get rewarded for doing so, and maybe avoid punishment for not doing so. Now, I should point out that there is nothing in the definition of totalitarianism that would necessarily predispose a totalitarian regime to starting an aggressive war. If we accept the idea that Friedrich and Brzezinski had, that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were both totalitarian dictatorships, one of them started an aggressive imperialistic war in the 30s and the other one didn't. Although, to be fair, the Soviet Union did do its share of imperialist invasions, such as Hungary in 1956 and Afghanistan in 1979, or you could even go back to the Molotov-von Ribbentrop Pact and say that that's sort of an imperialist handshake between Nazi Germany and Stalin's Russia. And you could certainly make the case that Russia's current invasion of Ukraine is driven by imperialism. But if we were going to try to make a link between totalitarianism and invasion per se, it would probably be that a totalitarian state will invade its neighbors not just to get territory, but also to spread its ideology and to try to achieve that utopian state of being that it envisions. So while the academic definition of totalitarianism may not fit today's Russia to a proverbial T, it is certainly a dictatorship, and it is clearly not a democracy. So a democracy, as you know, at the most fundamental level, is characterized by free and fair elections, competitive elections, and these should take place at regular, predictable intervals. Russia has had elections on schedule ever since the end of communism. They haven't missed one, but they are increasingly not free or fair. So there's not an equal playing field for all of the parties. So it's not a democracy, and outside of Russia, nobody characterizes it that way, although some people will use the term democracy, but they'll give it like an adjectival modifier. So you might hear terms like sovereign democracy, or managed democracy, or my favorite, illiberal democracy. But I think if you have to put an adjective like that in front of it, it's not a democracy. Now, Russia still has some political space for opposition parties, although that space has shrunk a lot in the last 10 years through the assassination of political competitors, people like Boris Nemtsov in 2015, or the imprisonment of political competitors to Putin, like Alexei Navalny, who was imprisoned in 2020 and then died in jail last year. And the space has also shrunk through the failure of some of Russia's political parties to assert any independence of the regime and of the United Russia Party, which is most closely affiliated with Putin. And other parties have failed to find a common language with more than 2 or 3% of the population. So there is a liberal party, Yabloko, but they haven't gotten more than a couple of percentage points in the elections, and so have not made it into the parliament since 2003. Now, there is a structural reason for the weakness of political parties in Russia, and that is the overwhelming power of the executive branch. In fact, if there's one thing today that Russia's political system has in common with the Soviet regime, or even the Tsarist regime before that, and with the Yeltsin government in the 1990s, it is extremely strong executive power, where the executive branch is much stronger than the legislature or the courts. So in the Soviet era, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union wielded enormous power. And the same was true in the Yeltsin Constitution that was passed in 1993 in post-communist Russia, which created a presidency that has overwhelming power compared to the parliament. And that situation obviously continues today under Putin. Given the persistent characteristic of a super strong executive from the Soviet regime to the present, but also the fact that there are ways that totalitarianism doesn't quite fit the Russian regime, I actually prefer a different way of characterizing the political system in Russia, and that is as a personalistic dictatorship. There are lots of different kinds of dictatorships other than totalitarian dictatorships. There are military dictatorships, there are theocratic or religious dictatorships, there are personalistic dictatorships. So now these personalistic dictatorships are regimes in which the lion's share of power lies in the hands of one person. Access to high-level positions, access to financial benefits, and other rewards are highly dependent on the decisions of the personalist dictator. And the people who hold high positions in the state and the economy are likely to have those positions because of their connection to and loyalty to the leader. The leader might be the head of a political party, but as in a totalitarian regime, if there is a party that's involved in running the state, that party is controlled by the dictator. In that kind of regime, because the people who hold high positions will only hold those positions as long as the dictator is in place, those people are not likely to conspire to remove the dictator. And because so much depends on the dictator, because so much power is centralized in the executive, the checks and balances that are found in more democratic regimes are absent. So the parliament in Russia is quite powerless compared to the executive, and so are the courts. And this leaves the personalistic dictator quite a lot of room to repress their opponents and to make policy without really having to convince the other political institutions of the wisdom of that policy, because the other political institutions are not very powerful. This includes policies like going to war or actions like putting your opponents in jail. Political scientist at George Washington University, Henry Hale, explains how this kind of regime works in a little more detail. So in a personalistic dictatorship, which he calls a patronal regime, patronal as in patronage, power is held by the patron-in-chief, and that person is the one in charge who has the ability to reward and punish individuals in this kind of hierarchical, top-down network. So Henry Hale explains that under the dictator, you sort of have three groups of elites. You have regional and local political leaders, you have business elites, and you have, which in Russia is what we usually call oligarchs nowadays, but that's what they are, is business elites, and the people who work in the branches of government that have a lot of coercive power at their disposal. And as Henry Hale puts it, quote, whoever controls these local political bosses, the oligarchs and the state officials, controls the country. And that person is the patron-in-chief. In Russia's case, that is definitely Putin. And as you can imagine, the elites are incentivized to work in the interests of the patron, to work in the interests of the chief executive. Because if you are inside that system, you benefit from it. And if you don't support the patron, you will find yourself outside the system and possibly punished. Now, as long as the elites are pretty convinced that the patron is going to stay in power, they don't see any reason to get rid of that person. When the leader is weakened for some reason, so maybe because of their health, or because of some kind of political crisis or economic crisis, then the elites might start struggling with each other over succession. So in a personalistic dictatorship, elites' expectations determine a lot. And in the context, let's say, of Russia's war against Ukraine, if elites determine that Putin is likely to stay in power, then they are going to express support for the war, for the invasion. Those who don't will stay silent, or they will leave the country, because they know if they stay, they're going to be punished for their dissent, and things will go badly for them. All right, beyond rewards and punishments for elites, though, there are other ways that personalistic dictators stay in power. One of these ways is by hollowing out the other institutions of government. So the political scientists Steve Hansen and Jeff Kopstein, in their book, The Assault on the State, talk about this. They talk about how personalistic dictators try to reduce the power of state bureaucracies, because those bureaucracies can offset the power of the leader. So in a modern rule of law state, the civil service, the state institutions like national security bodies or health, education, and welfare bureaucracies, in the modern rule of law state, those bureaucracies are staffed on the basis of merit and expertise. But in personalistic dictatorships, they are staffed on the basis of loyalty, or they're just decimated, or both. The other thing we have to remember about personalistic dictatorships and how they remain in power is that the regime has to acquire some level of legitimacy. In other words, it's not just about keeping the elites happy. You have to think about the rest of the population as well. And all kinds of regimes, all of them, they all use a combination of legitimacy and coercion. And these things exist in inverse proportion to each other. So the more legitimacy your regime has, the less coercion you need to use, and vice versa. The source of that legitimacy, it can be the economy, so economic growth, although again for Russia that hasn't really been the case for about the last 10 years. Another source of legitimacy can be patriotic pride, pride in the power or strength of one's country. And one of the most basic ways for political leaders to assert their legitimacy is by pointing to their own strength and toughness, both of these qualities being closely associated with masculinity. Now, in Russia's case, when Putin came to power as president 25 years ago, the image-making campaign focused on the idea that Putin's strength is identified with Russia's strength as a country. That Russia is going to be strong under Putin, which is something you can still see in this campaign billboard from 2018. And Putin has definitely played on the idea of reasserting Russia's international strength over the last decade, whether by illegally annexing Crimea or getting involved in the Syrian civil war a decade ago. And at this point, only time will tell whether Russia's assault on Ukraine will successfully be portrayed by the regime as some kind of patriotic move, to defend Russia's national interests and therefore sort of become a source of regime legitimacy, or whether instead it will be the downfall of the current regime in Russia. Okay, so as promised, I'm going to stop there. And now it's your turn. I am going to ask you to please turn to the person next to you or nearest you. If you don't know each other, just introduce yourselves. And then I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to talk with each other about which elements of dictatorship, so which aspects of dictatorship that you heard about tonight or other ones that you bring to the table, which elements of dictatorship you think are relevant to the United States or another country that might be relevant for you. And then we're going to come back together, and I'm going to ask you to share some of the ideas that you talked about in your pairs with all of us. Like, not everybody has to share, but if you want to, I'll ask you to raise your hands and share. So go ahead and pair up, talk with each other about a few elements of dictatorship that you think are relevant to the US, either now or in the near future, and I will stop you after about 3 minutes. Okay, go ahead and pair up.